Hi, and welcome to Keep Creative in Conversation. And today I'm joined by Lydia from Enkel. She is a sustainable fashion consultant, and she will explain a little bit more about what she does now.
Hi, morning, Andrew. So I run Enkel Consulting, which I set up a couple of years ago after spending over 20 years working as a fashion buyer in the industry and really starting to understand the true impact of the fashion industry. So Enkel is all about driving a better future for the fashion industry, and I also run a school and workshops and courses to create a better future for the industry.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lydia. And I think really part of the introduction is to look at how sustainable is fashion in itself. And we've got a kind of roundup really for what we think the year's going to look ahead. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've just taken a bit of a step back to think, right, what are the kind of key topics on our agenda really? Obviously 2025 is a big year in terms of achieving goals. So yeah, what are the big 5 things to focus on?
One of the key points of looking at sustainability in fashion is understanding what's coming ahead of us. So Lydia's going to go through now and look at the top 5 trends of 2025. Is that right, Lydia?
Yeah, absolutely. So my top 5 for 25, I mean, obviously there's a lot of things going on, but firstly, it's about the shared economy. So really understanding what the shared economy is all about, understanding about consumer behaviour and how they're engaging with brands. Then at number 2 is about materials really do matter. So what is the impact of materials and what are the materials of the future? Then we've got at number 3, thinking about transparency, which is going to be absolutely huge given all the legislation that's coming into play, especially in the EU. Then at number 4 is about really embracing circular business models and understanding what those are as an opportunity for your business. And then finally, one that I'm actually really excited about is textile recycling. So this is about thinking about waste materials and how actually they're really becoming a valuable resource, and how we can really potentialise that within our businesses.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Okay, so I think we've got a couple of questions to go through on some of these topics because I think for me, the big things that stand out is how do you communicate to an audience those key top 5 points that you think are going to be the biggest trends? And I think when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about reusability, when we talk about fashion trends, there's so much to kind of cover, isn't there? That I think if we can kind of narrow down into key questions, and perhaps I could ask you a few of those and just see what your thoughts are on them. What we want to try and do then is understand a little bit more about the 5 key points, Lydia. And with that, really, you mentioned the first point, which is the shared economy. Can you tell us a little bit about what the shared economy is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to see how kind of society has changed over recent years, and what we've sort of seen in other industries, so like Spotify, Netflix, Airbnb, where you've kind of almost got like services and products like on demand. We're starting to see that play out in fashion now. So it's more about accessibility instead of ownership. So instead of
Mm.
actually owning all these things, you just kind of have them, rent them, borrow them, and swap them, as and when you need them. And so it's much more about sort of sharing what we own as a society, rather
Ah,
than actually owning them outright ourselves.
okay. And with that in mind, then, what do you reckon brands need to do to make sure renting or swapping clothes becomes as normal as, for example, streaming Netflix? Like, do you see it as a kind of streaming type of thing where people are kind of swapping clothes out and in, and it becomes a hybrid model like that? What do you think it will be?
So I think what's been really interesting in the last few years is that we've seen so many brands partner up on take back schemes whereby they're encouraging customers to bring their product back, and they will responsibly deal with that product, and then it sort of almost encourage the customer to maybe buy something else in their collection, but it's keeping the products in circulation. And we've seen a lot of that, but ultimately, what we're not seeing is that brands are actually reducing the amount of stuff that they produce and sell as new, like offset
Mm.
by other business models. And that's essentially kind of what we need to see. But what has happened in the last few years is that it's become a lot more accessible by brands for consumers to use these products and services. But I think one of the really big things is about brands really kind of owning it and it being really kind of integrated as part of their business model. So not just like, oh, well, we've launched this or we've launched that as sort of a latest initiative, but actually it becoming a core part of the business model. And within that, I think the customer experience is really important as well, because quite often what will happen is, you'll join forces or collaborate with another company, which is fantastic in terms of, progress, with someone who's maybe a little bit further down the line than you are. But sometimes they might have a very different sort of consumer experience than maybe your brand has. So it's about really sort of building and owning that as part of your own business model that replicates your vision, your values for your brand. And it's something that's just part of what you do for customers, and it's available to them.
So what I'm hearing there really is kind of building out a core bit of the new business model, your structure around renting and swapping as a main source, not just a kind of side profile or side angle. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, brands do kind of initiatives because obviously, they need to try these things. They need to, gain customer reaction, and they need to gain traction with their audience, and they need to understand that this is something that, they can build into their business. So they need to try things at first. But what this needs to be about is it really is integrated, and you've seen that with obviously the likes of Patagonia with their workwear program. It's a part of their business model, it's a part of their revenue stream, and how customers are engaging with brands is changing, how their shopping is changing. So it's about businesses and brands really understanding what those different revenue streams could look like, and what opportunities that creates for them as a business.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be quite an exciting challenge for them, isn't it, as brands to kind of develop that concept with their in-house teams and external agencies too. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch out for the year ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, when you think of kind of the younger generations and, how they're engaging with brands, and this whole kind of idea of like secondhand as first choice, which is really interesting because that's a real kind of shift in consumer behaviour. So, really just understanding the different segments of the market as well, and how their behavioural change is impacting what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you. And I think that's more information obviously will be found in your newsletter, and you can find the information on Lydia's website, which is thisisenkel.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
So I guess we're kind of covering the synopsis of these angles that we think are going to be trends for the year. But also what's interesting is any more further information, you can always ask Lydia and she'll be able to direct you straight through to the information, which we'll find links to as well with this podcast. Materials really do matter. I know you covered that a little bit earlier briefly as part of the top 5 of 25. Can you tell us a bit more about what you mean by that? Why? I guess it's part of the materiality conversation, isn't it? And what does that really mean? If we can kind of give a synopsis on what that is for perhaps people that are unfamiliar with materiality in fashion.
Yeah, so obviously there's a whole host of different materials that are used in the industry, and all of those materials have a different impact on the environment and on wider society. But then there's also lots of different factors that are influencing materials and material availability. And ultimately, most of our materials are grown or they do come from land, and ultimately, we're kind of using up resources faster than we can kind of grow them, and there's a huge consequence of that. So really actually thinking about the materials that we do use within our clothes, what the impact and what the consequences of that are, and what the alternatives are. The biggest sort of challenge really is a lot of people don't really understand materials, and why would they? Because it's not something we were ever sort of really educated in. So, really understanding what materials, where they come from, what the impact of those are, and then understanding a little bit more about some of these, weird and wonderful materials that we're seeing coming on the market. But what's the reality of that? And, is it something that we're really going to start seeing as materials of the future?
Yeah, and I think some interesting points that pop up into my head when we're talking about materiality, and I'm with you on that. When I came into this, very little knowledge about materiality as a subject matter, because it really wasn't the main structure of what the creative industry that I worked in was based on. So what what I found interesting is going down a materiality route is understanding what is synthetic materials versus what's natural man-made fibers. Sorry, let's say that again. Man-made fibers, which is synthetic, versus kind of natural fibers, which are more like cotton and kind of natural products. And I think there's a whole kind of conversation around biodiversity, which could be a whole new sort of avenue to go down as well, which is lots of talking points we want to try and cover. But I guess the idea is they really do matter. And the focus on this year would be interesting to see what that is. So I guess my question to you is, what in your opinion, sorry, I'd say that again. What in your opinion are the most pressing risks associated with continued reliance on things like synthetic materials?
So yeah, just quickly going back to what you had just said there, I think it's actually really interesting just to point out, like fashion and farming and fashion and science, they are polar opposites in terms of sort of subject matters. But actually, as I've gone through my career, I've realised how actually closely linked they are. And I think that's been kind of really interesting to really sort of go back and understand sort of literally your base knowledge on where materials are from. But yeah, I mean, synthetics, they've dominated the fibre market since the sort of like 90s really, and they are about 65% of the materials that we use are synthetics, and most of that is actually polyester, so just over 54% is polyester, and that's derived from petroleum, it's derived from fossil fuels, so but there's a reason for that. They're cheap, they're long lasting, they're durable, they're quick drying, they have a place, or they had a place, but obviously in recent years, when we've all started to kind of realise the consequences and the impact of synthetics, that the challenge is, what alternatives are there? And there are alternatives. We've seen a huge rise in recycled polyester in recent years, but most of that is actually from plastic bottles, so that's almost creating another challenge. And I think we're going to see a lot of challenges around the supply, because of requirements in the kind of food and the bottle industry as well, which is going to affect sort of the feedstock demand from clothing. But really, recycled polyester, it's not a closed loop recycling process, as bottle industry is. So it's almost been the next best thing that we've got right now, but it doesn't mean that it's the right the right route for us in the future.
So I guess the risks associated with that are quite strenuous, because I guess what I'm hearing there is a lot of recycled fibers and constantly relying on petroleum or plastic based products, right? So I think that the thing that we're talking about is synthetic materials are derived from kind of fossil fuel industry, really. And you're saying, was it 65%, did you say, of clothes?
Yeah, so 65% of materials used are synthetics. So that's mainly polyester, but that also includes like sort of nylon, acrylics, other synthetics as well. But it is mainly polyester. And when you see, the likes of kind of fast fashion and Shein, that's very much dominated by polyester materials, but also used, very much in kind of outerwear, activewear, performance wear. They're very heavily reliant on synthetics, and that's because of their properties and their durability. And even though we're seeing lots of other innovations on the market, and there's some really great work being done, even polyester being able to be recycled back into new yarn. But the challenge is about scaling that at a level that it is, scalable commercially. And that takes time and it takes investment. And when you're up against a fibre that's essentially quite cheap to produce in the first place, that's where a lot of the challenges are coming in the industry, about making that available, at a scale that we need to meet demand from the industry.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I guess what I'm hearing there is that a lot of the fashion industry is based on fast turnarounds, right, with fast fashion. So those products, for anyone kind of new to this, really, if you go into a shop now and you look at the label of most clothing, and we talk about that 60+% being made of synthetic materials, I think you just need to go in the shop and have a proper read of the labels, and you'll see that most of it's made up of those materials. So it's very hard now to almost buy anything that's not that material, I suppose. And I guess the biggest challenge is, I hear, is in the industry, I suppose, with circularity, is how can you keep fashion circularity going, really. But that's a kind of another topic, I know. But it's just an interesting point, isn't it, when you suddenly realize the depth of conversation around just synthetic materials alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not, it's not just synthetics. It's like you talk about natural fibers and you think, oh, cotton's a natural fiber. That's good. But
Yeah,
actually, there's a whole host of challenges around the cotton industry. And, then you
right.
think about like animals and all our other materials that comes from animals and farming. And, then you think about like viscose, which comes from trees and deforestation. And,
Yeah,
literally it just blows your mind. There's just so much to learn and to understand, but actually once you kind of get a grasp of the basics, you're in a better position then to make more informed decisions, and I think that's the
yeah.
key. It's about really, the brands doing the right thing, but also consumers becoming more informed and more aware so that they can make better decisions.
Yeah, and really that's what this is about, isn't it? This is why we're having this conversations, because we understand to a point, for me especially, it's a communication breakdown, because the likes of the average person probably doesn't realize how much material is used to kind of clothe them.
Yeah,
And I
I think,
guess really, sorry, say, go on, Lydia.
yeah, I mean, I worked in the industry for like probably 10, 15 years before I
Yeah,
really started to understand a lot of this, because it just wasn't something that we knew. Like it just
yeah,
wasn't generally talked about. You didn't think about the impact and the consequence of what you were buying.
yeah.
Yeah, and
And I
obviously,
think that's where we're going to see that trend, especially on, your point two of the trend here, which is, materials really do matter. We're going to see that, right, develop this year. And I think that's a really good way to kind of have a synopsis view, but obviously there's lots of conversation around it, and we could kind of probably talk for about an hour just on this subject alone. But we'll move on to the next subject and keep them kind of short for now. And any more information, again, we'll put links to the bio and the follow up for this so that people can access your information. Because I think the one thing that Lydia does do really well is provide insight, and what you do with your company, Lydia, is fantastic. So yeah, look out for that. I guess more materiality conversations coming. Let's move on to the kind of third point that you made, which was about transparency. So this is such a tricky one, because I think we're always asking for companies, aren't we, and big institutions to be transparent. So I guess talk about what you see as transparency in fashion, particularly.
so I think. Well, if we just rewind, there was the
Mm.
Rana Plaza incident that happened back in 2013, and that was a factory, for any of those of you that don't know, it was a factory in Bangladesh that produced for loads and loads of well-known high street brands, and it collapsed. Over 1,000
Wow.
people lost their lives, mainly women. And when we were going through the kind of rubble, they were finding all these brands and brand names, and a lot of those brands were like, no, we don't make in that factory, because they didn't know. And
Oh,
it kind of really
really?
shone a spotlight on the industry of like how much kind of goes on behind the scenes that we just don't know, like further down the chain in different tiers,
Uh,
as we call them. And so it shone a real spotlight on, well, where are your clothes made? What are they made from? How are they made? What's the risks there? And as the last sort of 10 years has gone on, and there's been more awareness about fashion and its impact in terms of global change,
yeah,
and its impact in terms of pollution, consumers have become much more demanding about what they expect from brands, and they want to know more. And actually, we're seeing this whole wave of legislation now coming, especially in the EU. But that's all about really trying to reduce the impact that fashion has on the world,
right.
and really put things in place to shift to a circular economy, but also to reduce the impacts that the industry currently has, and the trajectory that it has, which is frightening.
Yeah, that is frightening, especially when you kind of consider a lot of those brands would know what their supply chain and how their structures and their factories work, and the fact that they didn't, and those big crises kind of happen and hit the headlines, only then does it become transparent, right? So I guess my question for you is, what steps would brands take now to measure really, or prepare for the upcoming legislation on transparency? Can you give us an example of what that would look like? What kind of products are coming out, or what do they need to do, basically, if
Yeah.
they're really going to be transparent for the sake of the customer? What does that look like?
So I think, when you talk about transparency, again, it just covers so many things, and it becomes really overwhelming. And there's a lot of industry jargon, and there's a lot of abbreviations. You've got ESPR regulations, you've got EPR,
Yeah,
you've got all these kind of different terms, and I think it's quite hard to understand. So I think one thing I would say which I always say is, wherever you work in the industry, and it's not just about product developers and designers and buyers, if you are putting brands on the market, you've got a huge responsibility and accountability for what you're putting out in the world.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to just first and foremost, just understand what it all means, like understand, what this legislation is. And even if you don't fall into the threshold of like needing to comply, I think you still need to have a wider understanding of what what it all means and why, and like a holistic view, because actually you do have a part to play, and by understanding that, you can then take some of those decisions into your own hands. Even if you don't actually need to comply as a brand, it's just about doing the right thing. So first and foremost, I think education and understanding and sort of staying informed and ahead is really important. But yeah, consumers, authorities, governments, they're all demanding more. One of the big things that we're going to see in the next couple of years is the introduction of digital product passports.
Oh, wow.
And this is going to be like absolutely game changing in the industry, because any product that gets put on the market in the EU will need to have this little code it could be in different forms, but most likely a QR code, which the customer can scan, and it will basically give a whole host of information about the product, where it's made, its impact, both kind of environmentally and socially, but also like how you can sort of deal with that product. So if you want it to get repaired, or you want to maybe sell it, or you need to get a new part for it, or any of these kind of things, it will basically give you guidance on what to do with that product, and who their kind of nominated partners are. And even right down to, well, what do I do with this? It's not fit for purpose anymore. It is waste. What do I do with it? Because I don't want to put it in the bin. So, this is going to be kind of really interesting for brands, but it's going to be very demanding in terms of actually kind of compiling all that information. So I think the other thing that brands need to really get aware with is just start collecting data, start asking the right questions, and start building that kind of knowledge hub, so that when it does become a legal requirement, you're in a much better place to be prepared.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And I think one of the things about a kind of, I guess, a byproduct of all of this is a product in itself, which is, to be able to regulate and understand what a product's life cycle is. They're going to introduce a new passport system to that. I think that's really hugely encouraging for a lot of people who want to follow sustainability and understand how these products and services are going to be rolled out. But I guess what I hear and what I see a lot, Lydia, and I don't know if this is going off topic a little bit, but I suppose a lot of this is coming from EU directives at the minute. Is that mainly where that kind of powerhouse shift is coming from, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as soon as you mention sort of, compliance and legality, people obviously start to stand up and listen. And a lot of these things are still very much in conversation, although we have seen some really great progress with various different policies actually being adopted by the EU. But yeah, I mean, obviously there is a drive, but I think, everyone keeps saying, okay, we need to wait for, the government to actually implement this. But actually, no, we don't need to wait. We haven't actually got time to wait. Like, the clock is ticking. We need to take accountability now. And I think that's what I feel really passionate about, is about making, legal stuff can be quite complicated. And it's like, okay, how do I break that down and just understand the basic sort of parameters of what that is all about, and how do I recognize what the red flags are in my supply chain and what the risks are, and start to have those meaningful conversations to make sure that you are compliant and you are in a good place and you are doing the right thing, and you can have those conversations confidently within your business and with your consumers as well, but it's about almost educating yourself on what it all means. And I actually think that's quite a challenge in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, I echo that. And I think what I hear and what I speak to with a lot of different consultancies and companies in this space is, it's kind of struggling to get the message heard sometimes, isn't it? As products like this that are so useful. And if they can only be harnessed and impacted on quicker, then this whole process will get smoother, because effectively, if a brand, I see the ones that really kind of are the game changers, the ones that come along and embrace this kind of change and say, that's going to be a problem. But if I release a passport, effectively a QR code on every item I'm doing, yes, the data is tricky, but I think a lot of companies, and certainly in fashion, a lot of brands, they know their customers, they've got the data. it's pretty much a case of going, okay, well, we know who we're targeting, but what they want to do is probably what you're saying is understand the material aspect of that supply chain and give your customer what they want to hear.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one thing I've been really proud of the last year is actually, I took on this kind of painful task of going through all of the legislations, because I was like, okay, where do you go to somebody to walk you through what it all means, what it all means and why? You're sort of bombarded with all these different terms and different regulations that are coming through, and I literally went through all of it, and I built a course that was like, right, I'll walk you through step by step what it all means.
Yeah.
And people were coming to me and they were saying, I've really enjoyed learning about legislation. And that is not something that a lot of people would have said previously.
No.
But actually, it's like, don't fear it, embrace it, learn about it, understand it, and start to implement what you can, where you are. And it's about, having the courage to have those conversations as well. And I think the only way you can embark on those difficult conversations is if you're a little bit more informed. And that's the bit where I'm trying to really sort of help people get more informed, so that they can have the courage to have those conversations and start really taking action. Otherwise, everything goes round in circles.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the key point, isn't it? Is to get to the information quicker so that you can make a uniform decision, or a kind of really a more informed decision on basically what you're going to do for your brand, or whether you're an individual, whether you're a consultant or a designer. It's all the same relevancy, isn't it? Because I think we're all in this space going, okay, well, how do we work with our skills and knowledge? And I think what you've done is a really good way to explain very compactly what people probably are struggling to understand. So that's great. And I know we can talk a lot.
Oh, sorry.
No, go on. Sorry, what you was going to say.
Another point is, I think what I saw kind of in industry was that, oh, well, that's someone else's job. That's the compliance team, that's the sustainability team, oh, well, we've got someone in legal who will look at that. And then when I took that step out, I was like, no, actually, we all need to really have that embedded in our own knowledge toolkit. You don't need to know everything, but you need to have a base knowledge of it. And I think it's quite hard to, I don't know where you really go to get that foundation knowledge. And it's not about, going and restudying at university for a year. It's about us all in the industry kind of unlearning what we've learned, because it's not fit for future. It's about making that information accessible to everyone and anyone who wants to really sort of level up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Well, then I know we can talk more about, and I think that there could be another conversation, because I think the digital passport, the product itself, is really fascinating. I think it's going to develop, right? So I'm sure we can kind of angle on that with more information later. So I'm going to move on to number 4, which you mentioned, which is circular business models. Tell us a little bit more, because I know I struggled with this at first, but I'm even trying to get my head around it and then trying to explain it to others. Once I did get my head around it, can you give us a kind of a quick idea what circular business models are? What is circularity, for example?
So generally as an industry, we talk about take, make and waste. And that's basically, we take the materials from the earth and we make our products and then we essentially, we finish with them and we just discard them. And that's very much kind of what the fashion industry has been built on. We talk about seasons, we talk about, the latest product, the latest trends. And so, we're seeing this huge amount of waste and obviously, everything becomes waste at some point in its life, but with fast fashion and the emergence of fast fashion in the last sort of 30 years, that's just become, astronomical and unmanageable. So when we talk about circular business models, it's about really understanding how we really capture the value of, all those things, all the crops that we've grown, the materials that we've sourced, the processes that we've taken to make the product, the people involved in the supply chain, all of the things that we've done, how we recapture the value of that and kind of reuse it back in the supply chain, rather than just, discarding and wasting it. So when we talk about circular business models, it's about keeping those products in circulation for as long as possible. So whether it's about, there's all these stats about we've got enough clothes on the earth to clothe, the next sort of 6 generations and all these crazy figures. But how do we really take what we've already got and kind of nurture that and sort of optimize that? So it's about keeping clothes in circulation for as long as possible through rental, resale, repairing them. And repair is really interesting actually, because it's almost creating something unique out of something that was maybe considered waste.
Yeah.
And so, brands have a huge opportunity now to look at these other kind of circular business models, as we call them, as like opportunities within their businesses and as
Yeah.
services for their customers.
Yeah.
The biggest one that's really sort of been gaining momentum in the last couple of years is resale. So resale, that's sort of growing faster than any other part of fashion. And everything that we're seeing and everything that the kind of statistics are telling us is that in the next few years, sort of as we approach 2030, about 18% of our wardrobes will be made up of second-hand items. And then we're
Wow.
seeing, the next generation, they're really buying into secondhand to be able to offer more sort of high-end, more premium brands. And
Yeah.
secondhand and sort of resale is becoming so much more accessible now and so much more available. And actually, there isn't the sort of same stigma
Yeah.
attached to it. I mean, obviously, vintage, secondhand, it's always been available, but it's almost like a different experience now. And it's about creating that experience for customers that has the same feeling as buying new. That same sort of shopping experience and that same fix almost, so that people are really open to it and really embracing it. And it's also about finding things that are unique as well, and things that are different, and that's all part of your sort of personality and your uniqueness as well. So yeah, we're seeing some really interesting business models emerge, and there's some brands doing some really fantastic work in these areas. So yeah, it's still relatively new, and I think a lot of brands are still trying to really understand, okay, can we drive revenue from this to really offset producing new? And that's something we're still sort of seeing play out. But yeah, it's really, really exciting area of opportunity.
Yeah, it is, and I think a lot of brands and have really cottoned onto that. And forgive the pun, but it's cottoned onto it and made it a real, because they realise that perhaps the next generation coming through are quite, they're looking for the trends, but they're looking for trends. The trends always come around. Sometimes we talk about fashion kind of repeating itself, doesn't it? And I think a big part of that is the next generation sort of wanting to try cool clothes and try different things, but they want something from the 80s and 90s, or they maybe have that kind of idea that now it's about a 90s sort of fashion style, isn't it? And I think that's where the repair, reuse and recycle kind of comes into play for the circular aspect of this conversation. And I think what I was going to ask you really specifically was how can brands take that idea of renting, reselling and repairing, and how can they make that feel like a natural part of shopping? What's the best way, perhaps, in your opinion, can they do that and make it feel like it's a natural progress rather than the kind of, hey, this is the latest thing and a trend topic? Is circularity going to be that important that it becomes just standard, really? And how can they work with that?
I think one of the things that really stands out is that you can't be all things to all people,
Yeah.
and it touches on so many different areas. So brands have really almost got an opportunity to drill down and think about their business model, like value proposition, and actually what's kind of most aligned in terms of circular business models. So if you're if you look at like a brand like Grenson in the UK, they're all about sort of craftsmanship and beautiful, well-made shoes that are designed and made to last. So actually, repair is really fitting for them, and actually they offer a fantastic repair service, and it's very much part of their business model.
Oh, wow.
If you look at a brand like Nudie Jeans in Sweden, they one of their strap lines is Forever Vintage, and they're very much their strap line is about repairs for life. And they do the most incredible repairs in their workshops. And actually, their repaired jeans sometimes cost more than their original jeans.
Oh, really?
Because they're so crafted and they're so curated, and they're almost like pieces of art. So I think for businesses, it's really about almost going back to like their business model and their heritage and what they stand for and what their values are, and really understanding what that kind of aligns with in terms of circular business models, and then really build on that and really build it and integrate it into their business model. What we're also seeing now is, brands are almost, they need to sort of trade up, and it's about, less fast fashion, but more, beautiful, well-designed products that are designed to last. And within that, what we're seeing with some brands is almost when you go to the shopping basket, it'll give you like a resale value. So, you might be investing in something, but thinking, well, I know that actually if I want to sell this in a year's time, I'm still going to get X percentage back. Or it might be, you buy something and then you can go and rent it. So it's almost giving the customer those different options. So they're seeing products much more as an investment than they are just as a transactional sale.
Yeah, amazing. I think just one note that sort of speaks out to me as well is perhaps you can tell me from your experience. I guess there's a sort of thing like, take Levi's, for example. There was Levi's made in the sort of 70s and 80s, and a lot of people that I know would go and buy an old pair of vintage Levi's. They do it because they feel the quality is still there in the original product. Is that the case with a lot of materials? Like they just think, do you know what? It was made from 100% cotton. It didn't have the stretch polyester fibers or the kind of mixed fibers that you have now. Is that part of the conversation too, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there was a shift it's very much aligned with when we started to see the rise in synthetics, so kind of in the late 90s, which to be honest is very much when I started in the industry. But yeah, I think there was a real shift then, and it was almost, that's when we started to see the shift over to China and to Asia in terms of volume manufacturing, and it became a race to the bottom then. It was about volume and price on the market. The high street was flooded with similar brands all offering very sort of similar products. That's not to say that there isn't still some fantastic, well-made products out there, but yeah, we definitely did start to see a real sort of shift in the industry. And I mean, it's funny now. I often talk about one of my contacts, and she has this jacket that she always wears when she does like live presentations, and it's actually her grandma's jacket, and
No
she's
way.
like, it's like my power suit. I put it on and it's like brings me joy, it makes me feel confident, but it's really well made and it's stood the test of time. And it's almost, we're sort of going back to that model now, and really seeing sort of the investment in products and seeing them as them as an investment, and how we can make them last as long as possible.
That's amazing.
Grandmother story. I mean, that's, people are seeing the value in products now, but I would never have been seen dead wearing anything from my grandma necessarily. But I think again, this is, it's a real shift in sort of consumer behaviour and consumer perception, which is really interesting.
And like you said, it's taking that stigma away too. You mentioned that earlier, and I think I heard that. It's like, you take the stigma away and you actually buy what you really want, but buy quality and buy something that's going to last, then kind of everyone's a winner, really, aren't they? Yeah. Well, lovely. And that's a really good insight. And again, I think we can kind of keep talking for so long about circular business, because I think it's such a big conversation point, like a lot of points and topics that you're mentioning, Lydia. I think the challenge is, we're giving you a condensed version of this very quickly as a synopsis, and we're talking very briefly about these points, but I think there's so much more to uncover and discover that it's going to be an exciting, I feel 2025 is one of those years where it's going to be an exciting revelation for a lot of companies, people out there and customers themselves going, I didn't know this. And now this is now it's out in the open, and, all the points we've already mentioned, we'll cover that. So that takes us really on to the point 5 now of you mentioned, which was textile recycling. What is it you see with textile recycling? What do you mean by textile recycling? Because I know you've mentioned it a little bit already, but tell us a bit more about what you see with textile recycling and what it is really.
So the reality is that very little textiles is actually recycled back into new products. So
really?
You have like upcycling and downcycling, but a lot of textiles is downcycled. It's used into like rags and even floor layering and stuff like that. Like, it's not really used back in the industry as such. But it's this whole concept of like, wouldn't it be great if we could make new clothes from old clothes? And that was a bit of a kind of vision for the future, but actually we're starting to see that now, and it's really exciting. And we're starting to see loads of kind of innovations where we're taking waste material and we're actually regenerating that back into new fibres that have the same quality and the same kind of lustre that the original yarns had. And that's traditionally been a real challenge in the industry. Recycled fibres generally, they didn't have the same sort of hand feel, and they weren't as smooth and all that sort of thing. But there's been so much work and innovation around that in recent years. Textile recycling has kind of been a bit of an underdog. No one really wanted to talk about sort of the dregs of textile waste. But
Yeah.
actually now the industry in the world is seeing that actually waste is a valuable resource and it's a huge, huge opportunity.
Yeah.
So textile recycling, I think essentially for brands, they need to think first about reducing waste in the first place. So it's all very well talking about what we can do with textile waste, but actually really we need to kind of go back to the beginning and stop producing so much waste in the first place.
Yeah. It's the logical thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's lots happening there around, kind of AI and forecasting
Yeah.
for businesses so that they're producing more of what they know is the right stuff and not so much waste. Customers buying better. And then we've got something called EPR, which is a legislation which is being introduced, which means that brands will need to take accountability for the waste that they produce.
Can you just tell us what EPR stands for quickly?
So EPR is extended producer responsibility, and where traditionally brands would, as I talked about with that take, make and waste model earlier, brands would only really need to think about the sale of products, then it was over to the consumer. But what EPR will do is it means that brands will actually need to take accountability for the waste that they generate as a business. So, beyond sale, they'll almost, they'll have to actually pay a contribution to dealing with that waste material.
Wow.
And that's going to be huge for the industry.
Yeah.
So it's really important for brands to think about those material choices, but think about almost the end of life at the beginning of life. So when they're designing products, they're almost thinking about, okay, what's going to happen to this product at the end of its life? How's it going to be disposed of? What material is it made of? And therefore, what's sort of the consequence of this? And actually really thinking about that right at the very beginning of when you're designing products.
Amazing. Yeah, and I guess that's going to be the push, isn't it? To kind of get back to the start point and say, to get to the end point, you really need to think about where the end point is first before you make the design and start that design, because then this whole process all the way through the value chain, right?
Yeah, and it's funny because when you look at other industries, like they have much higher recycling rates than textiles. So glass, paper, metal, we see all of that being separated out, but we haven't seen it in textiles. But actually, the reality is it's much more challenging to deconstruct a garment than it is to construct it. You've got components, you've got trims, you've got mixed fibres, you've got blends, it all becomes quite complicated. But what the governments are starting to impose now, and actually we've just seen it in Sweden where I'm based, is separate waste collections for textiles. So that means that textile waste won't go in household waste and won't get kind of all mixed up. And actually then it can be dealt with properly. Obviously, a lot of textiles is not able to be reused, but actually if there's a way that it can then be cleaned and reprocessed and then used back and made into new yarns, then that will be a huge opportunity for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key questions I have for you on that is, we talk about the fashion industry as a collective, but what do you think they can do? What's their kind of collaborative approach on this? Or is there one? And do you think there could be one, basically, to really harness the fact that really there's going to be, I guess, taxation around textile recycling?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the big things is actually when you're making those choices at the beginning, when you're designing products, is really thinking about your materials. Blends become very complicated to then separate. Although we are seeing some amazing innovations and technologies that will enable that, but generally blends are difficult. So, there's a lot of talk about using monofibers. So if you use like a single blend in a product rather than a cotton poly blend, which often, it might be for kind of performance and stretch and comfort, but a lot of time it's also about price as well. But think like mono blends will be easier to recycle at the end of life. So that's something that brands can think about. But also joining forces and starting to understand what those recycling opportunities are. And, we're starting to see recycling plants all over the world now. And that's something I talk about in my industry news. But, we're starting to see these recycling plants pop up both in the countries where the clothes are being made, but also closer to home where the brands are maybe located.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's about really joining forces and understanding what those opportunities are, and starting to collaborate with those businesses so that you've got a system in place to deal with the whole process that your business generates.
Yeah.
So yeah, starting to build those networks and build those collaborations.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of that, again, it comes back to transparency. Imagine your brand here, you can really deal with transparency and saying, we take a product and that whole textile recycling around that product from start to finish, so it's got an end of life cycle, is going to be really important for customers, because ones who value that are going to be kind of joining on board and go, well, I'm going to buy from that brand because they do this and they think about it all the way through, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, this
Yeah.
is it. There's a lot of things happening that's going to place a lot of pressure on the industry, but equally it's an amazing opportunity for the
Yeah.
narrative and for storytelling, and for brands to be able to trust those brands, because no one can
Yeah.
produce anything without waste. Everything becomes waste at some point, but actually doing the right thing with that waste and actually building the story around that, and having the right partnerships and collaborations to deal with things in the right way is going to be really, really important. But it's something that
Yeah.
hasn't really been talked about, and I think now we're seeing that come to the forefront now, and actually, yeah, it's really, really exciting and huge opportunity that brands should embrace.
Yeah, and I guess part of that is looking at the positive conversation around it and how do you communicate as a brand outwards from that? Because I think, like you said, it appears to be so much opportunity out there, yet it hasn't really been tapped into properly and effectively. And I think, for me, I think what I see is the brands that kind of harness that and jump on that quicker are going to be the ones that are more successful in the next 5 to 10 years, because they're calling it such a big decade of change at the minute, right? And I think what we're seeing and what we're saying here is there's massive opportunity. There's all these textile communication touch points. There's a lot to take in, but I think even through the work that you're doing with Enkel, is being able to understand that, clarify your purpose and position within it, and then redistribute your company and your directives thereafter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to know that no one's getting this right. No
Yeah.
one's there isn't what a silver bullet. That's the phrase. There isn't a silver bullet.
The magic bullet. The magic bullet. There's
To
no.
make all
Yeah.
this work. And
Yeah.
we're all trying to figure it all out. And I've been in the industry a long time, and I am learning every single day, and I'm trying to share as much of that as possible. But
Yeah.
that there's a lot going on, and it's hard to get your head around. And so I think don't be afraid to not have the conversations, because you maybe don't know all the answers, but just get started. Understand what's out there, educate yourself, have those conversations, and try and move forward in whichever way you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's amazing. And the work that you're doing is really so good at being able to kind of highlight the touch points that people can take on and harness. And I think that's what this is all about. Certainly in our conversation, how we've met, it's really about collaboration for me. And I think if you work with brands, collaborate with brands, and then use everyone's individual expertise, but it's a kind of collaboration, I think we're going to be a lot better off quicker and further down the road. It's just about harnessing the information, isn't it, and moving forward. So I think really good points. But that's it, really. That's the top 5 of 2025 with Lydia. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me today. And I think what we're going to try and do is work on this, build it out for more communication information, and we're going to send links and information out to anyone watching this. And obviously followers of you and followers of me are going to be able to understand a little bit more as they move forward.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Lydia. Thank you.